This learning module is about government offices and ranks in traditional Japan. I'll talk a little bit about modern Japan later on, but very little. So let me start with the background, the context here. In Japan, as in China, we often read about people of certain ranks, particularly if you're reading a piece of Heian period literature like the Tale of Genji or the Pillow Book. Overlapping with the imperial titles, which the Japanese borrowed from China, of course, are also military ranks of the samurai class, although our main focus today is going to be on imperial titles. There is much less change over time in Japan in ranks, although there is a little bit of variance. So the good news is, although this is a complicated subject, it could be more complicated. Let me start by showing you an example of a text that mentions lots of different ranks. This is the opening passage to the Tale of Genji, and here I've highlighted references to specific ranks and also just to general sort of social position. You can tell here on the very first page we have 7 different references to rank. Rank was really important to people in the Heian period. And so it's good to be at least familiar in passing with how this system worked so that you can appreciate more what's going on in works of fiction like this. Now let me also give you a little bit of a background of what happened in China. On this slide and subsequent slides, we're going to be moving through the structure of rank in China, starting very early on in the Zhou. And as we move forward, we'll see that it becomes a little bit more complicated, but with each dynasty, the detail becomes greater. Really, for the Chinese, the era when court ranks became, let's say, the most cemented was the Tang Dynasty. And if you look at those years, it's 618 to 904. This is the period during which Japan also borrowed not just court rank, the idea of court rank and the civil service system, which we've already talked about from China, but also a lot of the philosophy, Confucianism, and Buddhism. So Tang China is the real influential period. After Tang China, this system of court ranks and organization remains in not the Tang system, but the idea of having a court system remains in China. But as you'll see, it's not the same as in the Tang. So in the Sung, we see a significant change. In the Yuan, we also see a significant change. The emperor is always at the top of that hierarchy, but the bureaus and the secretariats and things like that change around quite a lot. Why was that? Well, because we're looking at different dynasties, and of course, as we talked about when we were looking at reign titles and things like that in the chronology learning module, we saw that each dynasty is really seen as a new turning over of a new leaf, a new ruling class, and so the organization of the government and of the high court then subsequently changes. However, in the case of Japan, we have a much different environment. So what happens in the Japanese context? Well, before I start talking specifically about these 3 different ranks, let me point out that in the case of China, men gained rank in the imperial court through the civil service examination system. I've mentioned that before, this grueling system of examinations, and if you passed, if you did well in those examinations, then you would earn the ability to hold office. You didn't necessarily then get an office, but at least you had the qualifications to hold an office. What happens in Japan is remarkably different. So although the Japanese look at the Chinese Tang model and borrow it largely wholesale in terms of its structure, what they didn't borrow was the exam system. And so when we read about these high courtiers in Heian period literature, for example, we're reading about people who gained their position through who they knew, through their connections, through their relatives, through their social connections within the imperial court. Now, rank was still tremendously important, as I mentioned, but the way that one earned that rank was not through that civil service examination. Moreover, when the Japanese borrow this Tang system, it kind of ends up going into stasis, if you will, in the Japanese context. So while the Chinese are evolving and changing the organization of their civil service and their government, the Japanese at the imperial level, imperial court level, maintain that system that's established for them in the Han period, borrowed from the Tang. This is why, if you look at a classical Japanese dictionary, a Kogo Jiten, and you look in the back, or you're looking at the Princeton Companion to Classical Japanese Literature, the section that I assigned for reading for this learning module, they can present this largely as a static event. So you've got a chart of different ranks, which we're also going to be looking at in today's lecture, and they don't change very much over time. But as we just saw in the Chinese context with each dynasty, there's remarkable change. So you can't find the equivalent charts in the Chinese literature that you can find in a Japanese classical dictionary. And it's pretty standard in a classical dictionary to have a chart of court ranks. They might differ a little bit from what we're going to look at today, but it is really a standard appendix. Okay, so let's return to our slide. I want to start with ranks that are held by men. There are three major intersecting ranking systems of which you need to be aware. One is noble titles. The next is government ranks. And then the last is military ranks. And I'm really not going to spend a lot of time on military ranks today. I'm really just focusing on noble titles and government ranks. So as in China, as in Tang China, these systems overlap. My big goal today is to help you wrap your brain around this, how this works. So one could be or would be nobility and simultaneously hold a government rank. They were overlapping circles in that great Venn diagram of the world. So let's start with noble titles. This is the top echelon of society. And of course, it begins with the emperor. The emperor is the person who was actually, in English, we often say on the throne. There wasn't necessarily a throne, but the person who is the sovereign at any given time. This rank was not obtained through primogeniture, and rather, it was an appointed position. But that said, often it was the son of the emperor who followed in the imperial line. More often than not, it was the son of the emperor in Japanese history. The emperor was also considered a Shinto shaman, so his position was both political and religious. This is a picture of the Taisho emperor. The previous picture was the Meiji emperor. And then, of course, the next emperor was the Showa emperor. And I don't have a picture of the current emperor, but you get the basic idea. Okay, the next noble rank is cloistered emperors. And as a category, we call that insei. There's a bunch of different possible terms here. Insei is the general term, which refers to retired emperors. There were, however, categories. Abdicated emperors were called Daijo Tenno, or Daijoko, or Joko. If an emperor abdicated to take religious vows, Buddhist religious vows, he would then be called a Daijoho. But they're all in the same category of cloistered emperor. Next we have regents, sessho. A regent tutored, advised, did the work, did the job for a child emperor or empress, or an emperor or empress that was, for some reason, incapable of doing his duty. Maybe he was infirm, who knows, right? So the regent was usually a relative of the emperor or the empress. Closely connected to the regent is the chancellor. A chancellor does what a regent does, but is usually not related. And if you go through Japanese history, you'll find records of both regents and chancellors wielding quite a lot of power. And then, I'm going to sort of cross over this category of men and women here briefly. We have princes and princesses, shinno and naishinno. Princes and princesses were not all the children of the emperor are necessarily given this title. In many cases, an emperor would have lots of children, not just one wife, but a wife, and second wife, a concubine, what have you. Right? So there's lots of children of the emperor, but that didn't necessarily mean that one was given this title of prince or princess. So, for example, a child of the emperor could be designated instead a member of a non-imperial family. A great example is at the end of the Han period, the Minamoto family or the Taira family. So we see some of the children of the emperor would then be assigned, if you will, to the Minamoto family or to the Taira family instead. Now, it was always really important to the imperial family that they had somebody waiting in the wings to become the emperor at any given point. And so I'm going to move out of the Han period a little bit and into the medieval and the Tokugawa period and mention the Sesshu Shinnoke. This was a collective name for the four cadet branches of the imperial household of Japan. And they were entitled to provide a successor to the throne, the imperial throne, if the main line failed to produce an heir. So this is what I mean by having somebody in the wings ready to go. The heads of these royal houses held the title of imperial prince or shinno, regardless of their genealogical distance from the reigning emperor. And the term sesshu in their designation meant that they were eligible for succession. So they were princes. They could become the emperor if they were designated such. So you could see here the four houses that existed over time. And this is kind of a messy history. I'm not going to give you all the details. The oldest of these houses is the Fushimi no Miya, and that was founded in 1409. And then we have Katsura no Miya, and then Arisugawa no Miya, and Kanin no Miya. Those last three, well, the last two are Tokugawa creations, and the Katsura no Miya is sort of right at the beginning of the Tokugawa also. And then they slowly fade out too. I didn't want to get into that history, but suffice it to say that when we get into medieval and Tokugawa, this system is set up to more guarantee the ability for the imperial family to continue on without any kind of break in succession. Okay, let's go on to noble titles that are held by women. How about imperial consorts and concubines? An official consort bore the title of junior consort Nyogo, or empress Kogo, or Chugu, and might eventually be named grand empress Kotaigo and senior grand empress Taiko Taigo. It's kind of a tongue twister. An unofficial consort was often known as the Lady of the Bedchamber, or Miyasu Dokoro. And for me, that always brings to mind this kind of image from the tale of Genji. Female officials, the most important of these were the mistress of the wardrobe, the Mikushige Dono, who often served as an imperial concubine, and the members of the handmaid's office, Naishi no Tsukasa, who were in constant attendance on the emperor. And again, this kind of thing always brings to mind for me the Heian period, although those positions continued on. Ladies in waiting of the emperor and his consorts. In the case of the emperor, these included the mistress of the wardrobe and the leading members of the handmaid's office. We'll see the handmaid's office later on our rank chart. And then there were imperial ladies. That was a title of respect sometimes conferred by an emperor on his mother, his sister, or maybe a woman of comparable standing. Okay, so keep all of that in one category that we just covered in your mind. Now I'm going to move on to other noble titles, which are, as you'll see on the next slide, hierarchically below what we were just looking at. So there are three major noble titles below the imperial family, and it's ladies in waiting and that stuff. So we have the high nobility, the kugyo, or the kuge. This is a small group, and when I say small, we're talking around 30, maybe less than 30. Absolutely the top of the social echelon. These men attended the emperor, and they held the top governmental ranks, as you'll see on the chart in a minute. And then the next title is attendant nobility, or tenjo bito. That tenjo means the palace. So tenjo bito are literally people who are allowed to go into the imperial palace. This is a larger group, but it's still not huge. It's between 25 and 100-ish, depends on where you are in Japanese history, who were attendants or courtiers to the emperor. And they also held middle governmental ranks. Now, I don't want to sound too snarky about this, but I got to say that when you read Heian literature, you really get the impression that it was the attendant nobility and the lesser nobility who were doing a lot of the work, and that the high nobility largely was doing ceremonial work, so to speak. Okay, the last category, the last noble title is lesser nobility, or jige. These were not people allowed into the imperial palace. They held the lowest of the government ranks, and there were many more of them, hundreds of them, and they really did that bureaucratic work of the government. So if we take these categories and we put them on a chart, it might look something like this. And I chose a pyramid to emphasize the numbers of people in each one of the categories. And then there's a note there that the imperial family sits above the nobility. So maybe I should have just had a pyramid with 4 sections. But you know, the imperial family so much sits in its own realm, in its own galaxy, that I didn't want to just throw it in with the high nobility, the attendant nobility, and the lesser nobility. So that is the first part of what we need to look at, the noble ranks. Now, what I want to do is look at governmental ranks. So we need to talk about what the civil service is. And happily, there's a good analogy. If you have a parent or a relative, a friend who works for the civil service, this may be familiar to you. And if you don't, then maybe you'll learn something about the U.S. in addition to Japan today. So a good analogy to the rank system that we're examining in this learning module is actually the U.S. civil service. So in the American Civil Service, New York State's got a civil service. We have lots of civil service employees here on the SUNY Albany campus. In the civil service, one enters a position first by taking a test. So we have John Smith, and John Smith wants a job with the civil service, and so he schedules to come in and take a civil service test. It does not involve the Confucian Classics, thank goodness. Usually it involves actual applicable skills. And so John Smith takes a test, and the test that he takes is actually specifically ranked, if you will. So let's say John is at entry level. Okay, if he's entry level, then he's taking a real low number test, a 2 or a 3 or something like that. To be honest, I'm not even sure that exists. I know that 11s exist. I know that 12s exist and 13s. In any event, he's set his sights on a specific level, and he takes that test and he passes that test. Great, that's the first step. And then the next thing that he has to do is apply for a job. And when he does that, he can say, okay, I passed the test to get this specific job. Let's say it's a job that requires having passed a level 11 test. So, okay, I passed my level 11 test last month, and so I'm qualified to apply for this job. And the job is to be a keyboard specialist. That's an actual title in the New York State Civil Service. And so the employer looks at all of his applicants, all of who are qualified because they've taken that test, and then chooses one of those people, and one of those people becomes a keyboard specialist. And then within the realm of keyboard specialists who have all passed that level 11 test, there's lots of them. Let's say here on SUNY Albany campus, dozens of them. Some of them have been working here for 1 year. Some of them have been working here for 20 years. They don't all have the same salary. Their salary is largely based on seniority and job performance. And so this chart kind of shows us, this is a real salary chart from the civil service. of the different grades, grades 1 through 15 on this chart, and the different steps. So step 1 is somebody who's newly entered the workforce, and step 10 is somebody who's been in the workforce for a longer time or is in some way more qualified, although still the same grade. Okay, that's in a quick nutshell what the how the civil service is structured, and I needed to give that to you so that you can map it on to what we're going to see in the Japanese context. We're not going to be looking at salaries, but certainly hierarchies. So in classical Japan, there were 9 rank or grade levels. Many more, of course, in the New York State civil service system, but in classical Japan there were 9. And each one had a subset of divisions, and I will be breaking these out for you. And as I mentioned earlier, the system was based on Tang China's system, bureaucratic system. The top 3 of those 9 rank grade levels were held by members of the upper aristocracy, the kuge. If you weren't a member of the kuge, you couldn't hold one of those positions. Those were super coveted, as I'm sure you can imagine. And of course, the kuge is that small number, maybe 30 people, right, who could possibly hold those positions. So here's a chart, and you'll find similar charts in the Princeton Companion to Classical Japanese Literature. I think maybe their presentation could have been a little bit clearer, so that's why I tried to recreate the charts here in the PowerPoint. At the very top, we have the ranks of imperial princes. So the imperial princes had their own categories, 1 through 4. I hadn't mentioned those on the previous slide. But there's so few imperial princes, it really, in a way, doesn't matter. What we really ought to focus on are the ranks of princes and officials below that. And so what I want you to notice, I will highlight it here, is that we start with a senior first rank, and then there is a junior first rank. So we've got rank 1, rank 2, rank 3, rank 4, and 4 has more subdivisions, and 5 has more subdivisions also. So as we go down in those ranks, we see increasing subdivisions. So I said there's 9, right? But then you can see that there are also subdivisions. And then we continue on with that chart here, 6, 7, 8, and then this one, it's not labeled as 9. I'm not sure what the etymology of that is. It's called the greater initial rank, or the initial rank as a category, and then there's a greater and there's lesser, okay? I always feel like initial ought to be at the top of the list, not the bottom, but there it is. So those are the 9 ranks that exist in the court, and I'm going to show you this on the map and on the chart in just a minute. Before we pull up the chart, though, I just want to give you a little bit of, not a word of warning, but a preparation. This chart, no matter what I do, no matter which version I'm messing with, I've never found a really good way to make the whole thing fit on a computer screen and be legible. It's just a little too complicated. So what I've done is I've taken a chart and I've made it bilingual by translating into English. That will make your life a little bit easier, but I've left the Japanese on there too. And I've posted it as an HTML file. So as we look at the chart, I'm going to have to keep moving it up and down and around so that you can see what I'm focusing on. And I apologize for that. But I really can't figure out a way around it. So here we are at our chart. There's a link to this on the Blackboard page also. And the x-axis is going to be going from left to right. So here you can see the senior first rank, the junior first rank. Let me go over a little bit further. Senior third, senior fourth, junior fourth. Not quite broken down as finely as what we were looking at in the previous chart, but you get the basic idea. So on the chart, those ranks are going across the top on the x-axis. So what's running along the y-axis of the chart? And the answer to that is government offices. So here we have the y-axis on the left going down. I start with the Grand Council of State. I'll be saying more about that next. And then the government service designation, the controlling board of the left, controlling board of the right, which all fall under the 8 ministries, etc., etc. Okay, so think about that. We got the x-axis going across the top with the ranks, and the government offices running down on the left. And then what we're going to find as we find the intersections there are specific jobs. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself there. So to simplify the chart, and here, unfortunately, just to make it work, I had to rotate it. So what we're looking at here is, in essence, the y-axis. We have the emperor at the top of the imperial government, and then the department, and he is the Department of Shinto, and then the Grand Council of State, and then beneath that, the controlling board of the left and the controlling board of the right, and then various ministries, as you see below that. So 4 ministries under each of the boards, left and right. So that Great Council of State has the following major titles. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the major titles in descending order. So the emperor is at the top, and then there's the prime minister, the major counselor, a middle counselor, a lesser counselor, a senior secretary, and a junior secretary. Let's take a look at what this looks like on the chart. Here's the Grand Council of State on the left, and if we scroll over, we see the prime minister. I didn't even start with the emperors up here. Okay. We have the prime minister, the great minister of the left, the right, and the center. Say more about that in just a minute. Major counselor, middle counselor. I skipped over these because they aren't considered by the Princeton Companion, at least, as major ranks. And then we have a lesser counselor, shonagon, as in say shonagon. And then the secretary here, the senior secretary and the junior secretary. So notice that each of those ranks corresponds to a specific numbered rank within the system. So if you were a middle counselor, you held the junior 3rd rank. If you were a major counselor, you held senior 3rd rank. Now what about that left, right, and center? There are often divisions within the titles, as we just saw. And they're designated left, right, and center. And that's the order in which the hierarchy sits. So a minister of the left is superior to a minister of the right is superior to a minister of the center. So for example, in the prime minister's office, there was a great minister of the left, a great minister of the right, and a great minister of the center. We don't have left, right, and center in every office, but many of them. So the offices of the imperial government had senior officials within the government there, and they were divided into 4 general classes. This holds for all office groups, if you will. Okay, so the Grand Council of State is a group. So there were 4 more overlapping categories. There was the head, the assistant, the secretary, and the clerk. And within each of those divisions were further divisions with various titles assigned to specific ranks. Now this can be a little bit confusing, but let me give it to you in a chart first, and then we'll look at the main rank chart and try and map it together. So in the Great Council of State, the prime minister and the great ministers were all considered heads. And in the Great Council of State, the major counselor and the middle counselor were both considered assistants. And the major controller of the left, all the way down to the minor controller, fell into the category of secretary. And the senior recorder of the left down to the junior secretary were all considered clerks. Okay, so let's take a look at what that looks like on the online chart. Although on this particular chart, I don't have those titles for the Grand Council of State, if we scroll over and we look at one of the ministries, doesn't even matter which ministry we're looking at, we'll notice that we see some of those terms. So here's the secretary, and then further on down, the clerks. And here's an assistant, right? The assistant was another one of the categories. So you can kind of map those four different larger groups onto these specific ranks. So let me get down into the governmental offices and the ministries, get out of the Grand Council of State and into the ministries. The ministries are referred to with the suffix "sho." There were 8 ministries, 4 on the right, that's in quotes, they didn't necessarily sit on the right, and 4 on the left, and each of which had subdivisions of bureaus or offices, ryo or tsukasa. These covered both issues dealing with the care and management of the imperial family and also with governmental or academic concerns. So this is really the governmental structure, if you will. So the 8 ministries are divided into bureaus, and those also, as we were just looking at the chart and seeing, were divided into the categories of head, assistant, secretary, and clerk. Within those 4 classes, there was a range of different titles for officials, depending upon the department, the ministry, or the bureau in which the person worked. Senior official positions also carried with them, on occasion, court rank. And in addition to the senior officials, there were also cohorts of junior officials attached to the various ministries and bureaus in order to carry out the essential tasks, I say menial tasks, of government. So for example, let's look at the Ministry of Civil Administration, the Jibusho. The Ministry of Civil Administration contained the following subdivisions: the Bureau of Music, the Bureau of Buddhism and Aliens, and here aliens doesn't mean Martians, it means anybody from outside of the capital, and the Mausolea Office. What does this look like on the chart? Here we are back at the upper left-hand corner of the chart, and the controlling board of the left has in it the Ministry of Civil Administration right here. And then underneath that we see the Bureau of Music, the Bureau of Buddhism and Aliens, and the Mausolea Office. Let's scroll over and see where those leaders sat. So the highest ranking person in the Ministry of Civil Administration was the minister himself, and he held senior 4th rank, as we can see at the top of the page. The next ranking person in that office was the senior assistant minister, and he held senior 5th rank. And then we see a junior assistant minister and a director, a senior secretary, an assistant director, a junior secretary, and as we keep going over to the right, it continues along following those 4 main categories that we were just looking at. Here is that again in a slightly different arrangement. So we have the title in the middle column, the rank on the right-hand column, and the class, head, assistant, secretary, or clerk, or other, on the left-hand column. There's a lot of different ways to organize this information, so I'm trying to give you a couple choices, like I said, to help you wrap your head around the whole thing. Now there were also non-ministerial organizations. They were in the capital and they were part of the government service, but they didn't sit under the umbrella of a ministry. So for example, the Board of Censors, the Divisions of Palace Guards, the Bureau of Horses, the Bureau of Military Storehouses, offices of Shinto priestesses, offices of the imperial family, and their attendants. What does this look like on the chart? Here we are again at the upper left-hand corner, and if we scroll down past the 8 ministries, the 8 ministries is a big chunk of this chart, we get to here, the Board of Censors, the Palace Guards, the Bureau of Horses, the Military Storehouses, the High Priestess of the Ise Shrine, the High Priestess of the Kamo Shrine, the Office of Palace Repairs, the Crown Prince's Quarters, Women's Quarters of the Imperial Palace, and the Palace Attendant's Office. There's a lot of separate offices there outside of the ministries, as you can see. And if we scroll over to the right, we'll see the breakdown of different positions within those particular offices. I find some of the ones down here that have to do with women's quarters particularly interesting. So there was a clothing attendant, I guess no surprise there. Ladies of tables and sewing, table attendant, teacher of the classics, lady of letters, the sake serving lady. I guess that's what she did all day, every day. So all kinds of possibilities there. But while we're looking at this, I also want to point out, apropos of what we were doing in the previous learning module, that within the bureaus, within the 8 ministries and the bureaus, their sub-bureaus, we see categories that we might not normally expect. I think Ministry of Justice we might expect. You might not have expected the Bureau of Buddhism and Aliens. Further down here under the controlling board of the right, we see the Bureau of Carpentry, the Palace Kitchen, Palace Equipment, the Bureau of Medicine, the Sake Office. There's all kinds of specific sort of daily offices that are necessary for regular work within the Imperial Palace. And what I wanted to point out over here is we have a position who is a doctor of history. We also have the master timekeeper. You may recall I had mentioned when we were looking at time and keeping time in chronology that there was a specific office in the imperial court whose job it was to maintain the calendar and maintain an official statement, if you will, on what the date was, what the time was, that kind of thing. And this is where that office sat. There was also a master of yin yang and a doctor of music, doctor of text, doctor of numbers. All the scholars that were supporting the imperial family had these positions. They were ranked seventh, so they're not tremendously high, but they're still an important part of that larger picture. I also wanted to point out that outside of the imperial palace and outside of the capital, there were regional divisions. So think of them as outposts of the imperial realm, the imperial government. And we see there were eastern capital offices. Here, eastern would have extended east, not from modern-day Tokyo, but from modern-day Kyoto. Western capital offices, again, extending west from modern-day Kyoto. And then there were Dazaifu offices. Dazaifu was the original designation for Kyushu. And actually, the Dazaifu office was a very important one because that part of Kyushu, the northern part, northwestern part of Kyushu, is really the jumping off place if you're going to cross over the water and go to the mainland, to the Korean peninsula, and then consequently to China. So the Dazaifu offices held a very important role even in classical Japan, even though they were relatively far away from the capital. Okay, last but not least, I would be remiss if I didn't say something about military ranks. We're a lot easier with military ranks, I think, than we are with civil service ranks. It makes perfect sense to us to know that there are ranks in the military, and Japan is no exception. After the Heian period, the samurai class became much more prominent, much more powerful, eventually eclipsing the power of the imperial family. That doesn't mean that that system we just looked at of all those different imperial ranks disappears. It doesn't, but its significance is greatly reduced. The samurai, being a military organization, naturally had ranks, just like the modern-day army or navy has ranks. Within the samurai class, the top rank was a shogun, and under the shogun there were many daimyo, and I'll be saying a little bit more about daimyo when we do our geography unit. Eventually, the samurai class infiltrated even the very top tiers of the government, and thus it effectively took over the power structure of the country. The trick to the samurai class ranking system is that, unlike the Heian period system, which is relatively static, the samurai class is not a static organization. So the way it's organized differs from the Kamakura to the Muromachi to the Tokugawa. And the best way to find that information about what a particular rank meant at a particular time is probably in a classical Japanese dictionary. Often they'll have comparative charts. What about the modern day? Well, military titles under the Meiji were quite different because the military was restructured during the Meiji period. And then there was another restructuring after World War II when Japan renounced having a standing military except for self-defense. There are some comparison charts online that are kind of handy. Here's one of those charts. What we have is on the left the imperial military, in other words, prior to the end of World War II, titles that exist, ranks that exist in the Imperial Army, and on the right-hand side, ranks that exist in the self-defense forces. These are probably best found, these sorts of comparison charts are probably best found online, not in, for example, classical dictionaries. The classical dictionaries just don't cover this area. It's too modern. So that's ranks within the imperial court and a little bit about the military also.